I didn't think much of it when Jessica came home late again. It wasn't unusual these days. What caught my attention this time, though, was the faint scent of cologne on her clothes, the kind I didn't wear. At first, I thought it was an accident, maybe from brushing past someone in a crowded elevator or at one of those late-night work dinners she always seemed to have. But the smell lingered, faint but undeniably present, on her scarf the next morning as I picked it up to toss in the laundry. That was 2 weeks ago. It wasn't just the cologne. There was the careful way she started dressing, clothes that clung just a little too perfectly for the office, lipstick shades I hadn't seen before, heels she hadn't worn in years. She used to joke about hating anything taller than 2 inches, and now she strutted out the door like she was walking a runway. Still, I told myself not to jump to conclusions. People change, right? We'd been married 12 years, and maybe this was her way of keeping things fresh in her life. If it was about self-confidence, who was I to question it? But then there was the necklace. A slim gold chain, delicate but expensive looking. She wore it to a dinner party we hosted for friends. Jessica wasn't big on jewelry, she said it was impractical and usually only wore her wedding ring. Yet there it was, catching the light and drawing compliments from everyone. "That's beautiful," said my friend Paul's wife, Jen. "Ethan, did you get that for her?" I froze for half a second. Jessica answered smoothly, "It was a gift." "From me?" "No." Later that night, as I loaded the dishwasher, I asked about it. "So, who gave you the necklace?" Her response came too quickly, almost rehearsed. "Oh, it's from Stacy," she said, referring to her best friend. "She found it at a boutique and thought it would look nice on me." It felt wrong, but I let it slide. Things came to a head the following weekend. Jessica had another work thing, an evening cocktail event at some upscale hotel downtown. She left in a stunning black dress that hugged her figure perfectly, kissed me on the cheek, and told me not to wait up. I tried to distract myself, watched a basketball game, had a couple of beers, but around 11 p.m., I decided to head to bed. That's when I noticed her laptop bag sitting by the couch. She never left it behind. Curious, I unzipped it and peeked inside. At first, it seemed normal, a few files, her work planner, and then an envelope. Inside were 2 tickets to a Broadway show scheduled for the next day. 2 tickets, but no mention of me. The name on the envelope? Jessica and Oliver. Who the hell was Oliver? That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't confront her. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that everything in my life was about to change. The next morning, Jessica was all smiles. She strolled into the kitchen in her robe, humming to herself, and grabbed a cup of coffee. She didn't seem to notice the tension in the air. I sat at the table, pretending to read the news on my phone, though my mind was focused on one thing, the name Oliver. I couldn't bring it up, not yet. Not until I knew more. Asking too soon would only give her a chance to spin a story. She kissed me on the cheek, saying, "I'll be working late again tonight. Don't wait up, okay?" I nodded, barely managing to suppress the wave of irritation rising in my chest. "Sure. Busy schedule, huh?" She shrugged, her tone casual. "It's that time of year. Lots of projects wrapping up." I watched her leave the room, her black coffee in hand, and then I made my decision. Whatever this was, it needed to stop. But first, I had to know what I was up against. That evening, I told Jessica I had plans with a friend. She didn't ask any questions, why would she? I wasn't the suspicious type. The truth was, I wasn't going to meet a friend. I followed her. Her car pulled out of the driveway at 6:45, and I kept a safe distance as she drove toward downtown. She didn't head to her office, as I expected, but instead to a swanky restaurant on the east side. I parked a block away and walked toward the entrance, careful to keep out of sight. The place was crowded, well-dressed couples, groups of professionals, the kind of crowd you'd expect in a high-end spot. Jessica walked in like she belonged there, confidently weaving her way through the tables until she reached a man sitting alone in a corner booth. He stood when he saw her, a charming smile lighting up his face. "Oliver." He was maybe in his late 30s, polished and confident in a way that screamed money. He placed a hand on her lower back as she slid into the booth across from him. I clenched my fists at my sides, forcing myself to stay calm. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I stood, but their body language said enough. The leaning in, the laughter, the way his hand casually brushed hers across the table, it was all there. I snapped a few pictures on my phone, my hands shaking as I did. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a work dinner or a casual meetup. This was my wife with another man. I stayed long enough to see the waiter bring them wine and appetizers. Jessica laughed at something Oliver said, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was like watching a stranger wearing my wife's face. When they stood to leave, I followed at a distance. My heart raced as they exited the restaurant and walked toward a nearby hotel. They stopped at the entrance, and Oliver leaned down to whisper something in her ear. She smiled, nodded, and the two of them disappeared inside. I didn't follow them in. I didn't need to. Instead, I stood there on the sidewalk, trying to process what I'd just seen. This wasn't some paranoid fantasy. Jessica was having an affair. And now, I had to decide what to do about it. Back home, I paced the living room, my mind racing. Every conversation we'd had in recent months played on a loop in my head, every excuse, every late night, every work trip. How long had this been going on? Did she love him? Did she still love me? I poured myself a whiskey, needing something to steady my nerves, and pulled out my phone to review the photos I'd taken. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. I stayed up all night, replaying the evening in my mind, wondering how it had come to this. By the time Jessica walked through the door at 8 a.m., wearing the same clothes she'd left in, I was barely holding it together. She greeted me casually, as if nothing had happened. "Morning," she said, dropping her purse on the counter. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. Jessica didn't notice. She was already heading upstairs, probably to shower and erase any trace of her night with Oliver. As I watched her go, one thought crystallized in my mind: it was time to confront her. That evening, when Jessica came home, I was ready. The photos were printed, sitting in a neat stack on the dining room table. When she walked in, I didn't say a word. I just slid the pictures across the table toward her. "What's this?" she asked, her tone casual, but her face paled as she looked at the first image. I didn't let her speak. "How long?" I demanded, my voice low but shaking with barely contained anger. "Ethan, How long, Jessica?" Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked down at the photos again, then back at me, tears forming in her eyes. I didn't mean for this to happen," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room was silent except for the sound of my breathing. I waited for her to say something, anything that would make this better. Instead, she said, "Can we sit down and talk about this?" I stared at her, incredulous. "Talk? Now you want to talk? Were you thinking about talking when you walked into that hotel with him? Or when you were laughing at dinner like you didn't have a husband waiting for you at home?" Her tears started to fall, but I didn't care. I was beyond caring. "Just tell me the truth," I said. "How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, then admitted, "A few months." "A few months." My stomach turned. Why, Jessica? Was I not enough? Was our life not enough? She shook her head, sobbing now. "It's not like that. I love you, Ethan. I do. I just..." "You just what?" I interrupted. "Wanted something new? Someone new?" She didn't answer. I stood up, unable to look at her any longer. "I need some air," I said, grabbing my coat. "Ethan, please." But I was already out the door. When I came back home that night, Jessica was sitting in the living room, clutching her phone in both hands like it was a lifeline. Her eyes were red, probably from crying, and she looked up at me as soon as I walked in. She opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't let her. We're doing this now, I said firmly. She nodded, swallowing hard. Okay. Let's talk. Not talk, I snapped. You're going to explain everything. Start with how you ended up in a hotel with another man. Jessica flinched at my tone. It's not what you think. Don't insult me, Jessica, I cut her off, my voice rising. I followed you. I saw you with him. I know exactly what it is. Her hand shook as she set the phone down on the coffee table. It's not serious. It's just. Not serious? I shot back. You've been sneaking around for months, lying to my face, and it's not serious? That's your excuse? She started crying again, tears streaming down her face, but I wasn't moved. Ethan, I never meant to hurt you. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. Because you did. She buried her face in her hands for a moment, then looked up at me, her voice trembling. I don't know how it happened. I felt. I don't know, lost. Lonely. It's been a hard year, Anne. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, I interrupted. You were lonely? So you turned to some guy instead of talking to me? You chose this, Jessica. You chose him. I didn't choose him, she insisted. I made a mistake, Ethan. A terrible mistake. I let out a harsh laugh. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill or locking your keys in the car. Sleeping with someone else isn't a mistake. It's a choice. A selfish, deliberate choice. Her shoulders sagged, and she looked down at her lap. I don't know what else to say. I'm sorry. I am. I hate myself for what I've done. I stared at her, barely able to contain my anger. Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just cheat on me, you betrayed our family. Our kids. Everything we built together. And for what? Some cheap thrill? It wasn't like that, she whispered. Then what was it like? I demanded. Explain it to me. Make me understand. She hesitated, clearly struggling to find the words. He made me feel noticed, she finally said, her voice breaking. Like I mattered. Like I wasn't just a wife and a mom, but a person. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. So I don't make you feel that way? It's not that, she said quickly. You're a good husband, Ethan. A great one. But sometimes it felt like we were just going through the motions. Like we were roommates instead of partners. I shook my head in disbelief. So instead of talking to me about it, you decided to start sleeping with someone else. Real mature. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said again, as if that somehow made it better. I was done listening to her excuses. What happens now? I asked coldly. Are you planning to keep seeing him? No, she said immediately. It's over. I ended it. When? Tonight, she said, her voice barely audible. I scoffed. How convenient. You only ended it because you got caught. Her tears started again, and I looked away, unable to stand the sight of her. Ethan, please, she begged. I want to fix this. I want us to work through this. Work through this? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. How, Jessica? How do you expect me to move past this? To trust you again? I'll do whatever it takes, she said desperately. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just don't give up on us. I laughed bitterly. You already gave up on us the moment you let him into your life. She didn't respond, just sat there sobbing quietly. The sound grated on my nerves, but beneath my anger, there was a deep, aching sadness. This wasn't how our story was supposed to end. After a long silence, I stood up. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight, I said. Ethan. Don't, I said sharply. I need space. And so do you. I walked out of the room without looking back. I didn't want to see her broken expression, didn't want to feel the flicker of pity that might weaken my resolve. For the first time in our marriage, I locked the guest room door behind me. The next day, the numbness began to wear off, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. I wasn't just going to let Jessica walk away from this unscathed. She had turned my life into a joke, disrespected me, and trashed the trust we'd spent years building. She needed to feel what I felt to know what it was like to have everything ripped out from under her. The first step was to take control. I wasn't going to let her dictate the terms of what happened next. I started by gathering evidence. Those photos I had taken the night before were a good start, but I needed more. I went through every email account and phone record I could access. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Her work email was practically a treasure trove of damning material. She had been careless forwarding personal emails to her work address, sending flirty messages to Oliver, even using her company credit card to book their hotel room. The messages made me sick to my stomach, but I kept reading, driven by a twisted need to know every detail. One particularly galling exchange stood out. A week before our anniversary, she had written to him, "Wish I could spend the weekend with you instead. These traditions feel so hollow when my heart's somewhere else." My heart felt like it was being shredded, but at the same time, I was grateful for her carelessness. It would make what I had planned so much easier. I saved everything. Screenshots, emails, receipts. I created a folder and uploaded it to a secure cloud account. If Jessica wanted to play dirty, I'd show her just how dirty I could get. That night, I didn't say much to her. She kept looking at me with those tear-filled eyes, like she was hoping I'd forgive her if she looked pitiful enough. I couldn't bring myself to speak to her. Not yet. The next day, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I didn't want to rush into divorce, not because I was holding out hope for reconciliation, but because I wanted to make sure I did it right. I wasn't about to lose half of everything to a woman who had so casually thrown away our marriage. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca, assured me that with the evidence I had, I was in a strong position. She explained the process, laid out my options, and told me what I needed to do next. "Be smart," she said. "Don't confront her until you're ready to file. The more composed you are, the more leverage you'll have." I followed her advice. Over the next week, I began quietly disentangling myself from Jessica. I opened a separate bank account and redirected my paycheck. I moved any sentimental or valuable items that I cared about into a storage unit. I even took the spare key to the house and had a copy made, just in case. Jessica seemed to sense that something was happening. She tried to talk to me a few times, but I kept my responses short and neutral. "Ethan, can we please sit down and talk?" she asked one evening. "Not right now," I replied without looking at her. "Then when?" "I don't know. I'm still figuring things out." Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me with tears anymore. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a week later. I hired a private investigator to look into Oliver. I needed to know who this man was, his background, his job, his relationships. I wanted to know everything. The report came back quickly, and it was even better than I'd hoped. Oliver was married. His wife, Karen, was a kindergarten teacher, and they had 2 young children. The thought of those kids made my stomach turn, but it also gave me an idea. I reached out to Karen. At first, she was skeptical, but when I showed her the photos and emails, her tone changed. She was devastated, of course, but she was also furious. We talked for hours, sharing details and comparing notes. By the end of the call, we had a plan. A week later, everything was set. I waited until Jessica was at work, then printed out a packet of the most incriminating evidence I had: photos, emails, receipts. I included a note: "This is who you chose over your family. Congratulations." I placed the packet on the dining room table, along with the divorce papers I had prepared. Then, I left. I didn't just walk out of the house, I walked out of her life. I moved into a small apartment across town, one I'd already signed the lease for a week earlier. I changed my phone number, notified my lawyer, and left a message for Jessica's employer explaining that she might need some personal time to deal with family issues. When Jessica got home that night, she must have been blindsided. I didn't stick around to see her reaction, but I imagined the look on her face when she saw the packet and realized what was happening. Karen and I timed our actions perfectly. While Jessica was finding the evidence, Karen was confronting Oliver with the same information. From what I heard later, it was explosive. She kicked him out of the house, filed for divorce, and told his employer about the affair, which violated company policy. Within 48 hours, both of their lives were in shambles. Jessica called me dozens of times over the next few days, but I didn't answer. When she showed up at my apartment, I refused to let her in. "Ethan, please," she begged through the door. "We can fix this. Don't throw everything away." I opened the door just enough to meet her eyes. "You threw it away the moment you chose him." Then I shut the door in her face. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, I was finally in control. Jessica managed to find me 3 days later. I don't know how she got the address, maybe from a mutual friend, maybe from the lawyer's correspondence, but there she was, standing at my door again. This time, I opened it. Not because I wanted to see her, but because I needed to end things properly. "Come in," I said flatly, stepping aside. She walked in hesitantly, her eyes darting around the sparsely furnished apartment. "This is where you've been?" she asked, her voice trembling. I ignored the question and motioned toward the small table by the window. "Sit." She obeyed, sitting down on the edge of the chair like she might need to bolt at any moment. I stayed standing, arms crossed, leaning against the kitchen counter. "What do you want, Jessica?" Her hands fidgeted in her lap. I needed to see you. To talk. To explain." "We've talked," I interrupted. "You've explained. And I've made my decision." Her face crumpled, tears already forming. "Ethan, please. Don't do this. Don't throw us away." "You mean like you threw us away?" I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. She flinched, but I didn't apologize. "I've apologized," she said softly. "I know what I did was wrong. I've told you how sorry I am. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you let me." I laughed bitterly. "Making it up to me? How, Jessica? By pretending this never happened? By erasing the nights you spent with him? By wiping away the texts, the lies, the betrayal? Tell me, how exactly do you plan to fix what you broke?" She was silent, her head bowed. "Because I'll tell you right now," I continued, my voice steady, "you can't. There's no fixing this. No going back. You destroyed what we had." Jessica looked up at me, her tear-streaked face desperate. "Ethan, I love you. I've always loved you. What happened with Oliver, it didn't mean anything. It was a stupid, selfish mistake, but it wasn't about love. You're the one I want. The one I've always wanted." "If that's true," I said coldly, "then why did you do it? Why did you risk everything for someone who didn't mean anything?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if she didn't have an answer. I shook my head. "That's what I thought." "I wasn't thinking," she said finally. I felt lost. Disconnected. And he was there, and it was easy, and I. "Stop," I said, holding up a hand. "Just stop. I've heard it all before. You were lonely. You were stressed. You felt unnoticed. Do you think I haven't been lonely? That I haven't felt disconnected? But I didn't cheat, Jessica. I didn't betray you. I didn't drag our marriage through the mud because I wanted a distraction." She sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "I hate myself for what I've done. I'll do anything to make it right. Anything, Ethan. Please, just tell me what to do." I sat down across from her, my voice calm but firm. "What you can do, Jessica, is let me go. Let me move on. Because I can't do this anymore. I can't live with someone I can't trust. Her sobs grew louder, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt. But then I remembered the pain I'd felt, the humiliation, the anger, and I pushed the guilt aside. What about the kids? She asked through her tears. How do we tell them? How do we explain this to them? We tell them the truth, I said simply. That their mother made a choice, and that choice had consequences. That's not fair, she said, her voice rising. You're putting this all on me. I know I screwed up, but you. I what? I interrupted, leaning forward. What did I do, Jessica? Work too hard to provide for our family? Trust you to be honest with me? What exactly did I do to deserve this? She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. That's what I thought, I said, leaning back. This isn't about me, Jessica. It's about you. Your choices. Your actions. Your consequences. She was silent for a long time, her tears slowing. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and defeated. So that's it? You're just done? I nodded. I'm done. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But then she stood up, her shoulders slumped. Fine, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If that's what you want. It's not what I want, I said. It's what you left me with. Jessica turned and walked toward the door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, looking back at me one last time. I'll always love you, she said. I didn't respond. She opened the door and walked out, closing it quietly behind her. For a long time, I sat there at the table, staring at the spot where she had been. My chest felt heavy, but I knew I'd made the right decision. This wasn't the ending I'd wanted for us, but it was the ending we'd earned. After Jessica walked out of my apartment that day, I expected to feel relief, maybe even a sense of victory. Instead, I just felt empty. It wasn't the kind of emptiness you could fill with distractions or booze or even another person. It was the kind that forced you to sit with yourself and re-evaluate everything. The next few days were quiet. No calls from Jessica, no unannounced visits. She must have finally realized there was nothing left to say. That was good. I needed space to think about my next steps, to figure out how I was going to rebuild my life from the ashes of what we had. I started with logistics. The divorce papers were already in her hands, so it was just a matter of waiting for her response. I contacted the lawyer to go over the finer details, making sure everything was airtight. The financial separation was straightforward since I had been proactive about securing my assets, but the custody arrangement for the kids was trickier. We both loved them, that much I knew, but the trust between us was shattered. I didn't want our kids caught in the crossfire, didn't want them to feel like they had to pick a side. For now, I asked my lawyer to draft a temporary agreement where we'd share custody until the divorce was finalized. But it wasn't just about logistics. It was about understanding what this meant for my future, for who I was as a man, a father, and someone who had believed in the sanctity of marriage. A few days after Jessica's visit, I sat down with our kids, Sarah, who was 14, and Ben, who was 11. They had already sensed something was wrong. Kids are more perceptive than we give them credit for. I kept it as simple as I could. Your mom and I are separating, I told them. It's not because of anything you did, and it's not something you could have prevented. Sometimes, relationships don't work out the way we hope. Sarah started crying immediately. She was old enough to understand the implications, and her first words broke me. Is it because of me and Ben? Were we too much? I pulled her into a hug, trying to hold myself together for her sake. No, sweetheart. This has nothing to do with you or your brother. Your mom and I both love you more than anything in the world. That will never change. Ben was quiet, his face pale. Are we going to have to pick who to live with? He asked. No, I said firmly. You'll spend time with both of us. We're still your parents, no matter what. It wasn't the full truth. Jessica and I hadn't worked out the long-term custody arrangement yet, but I couldn't bring myself to burden them with those details. For the next hour, I answered their questions as honestly as I could. I didn't tell them about the affair. They didn't need to know that right now. All they needed to know was that I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was Jessica. After they went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, replaying the conversation in my head. I hated that they were caught in the middle of this. They didn't deserve it. But I reminded myself that shielding them from the worst of it was the best I could do. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, meetings with the lawyer, and awkward exchanges with Jessica. We only spoke when absolutely necessary, usually about the kids. She tried to apologize a few more times, but I shut her down each time. I don't need your apologies, I told her during one particularly tense conversation. I need you to focus on being a good mother to our kids. She nodded, her expression hollow. Despite the chaos, I started to feel a small sense of stability creeping back into my life. I threw myself into work, picking up extra projects to keep my mind occupied. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, letting them drag me out for beers and basketball games. Slowly but surely, I was reclaiming parts of myself that I hadn't realized I'd lost during my marriage. One afternoon, about a month after Jessica had left my apartment, I got a call from Karen, Oliver's wife. I just wanted to thank you, she said. For what? For telling me the truth, she replied. It was harder than I can even explain, but it gave me the push I needed to move on. I didn't know what to say. I'm just sorry it had to happen at all. Me too, she said. But you did the right thing. I hope you know that. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. Her words lingered in my mind, you did the right thing. It didn't feel like it at the time. I had questioned myself every step of the way, wondering if I'd been too harsh, too cold, too calculating. But hearing those words from someone who had suffered just as much as I had gave me a sense of clarity. The next time Jessica and I met to discuss the divorce, I felt a strange sense of calm. She looked tired, worn down, but I didn't feel the anger I'd carried for weeks. Are you doing okay? She asked hesitantly. I'm getting there, I said honestly. She nodded, then handed me a signed copy of the divorce papers. I'm sorry it ended like this, she said softly. So am I replied. But it had to. As she left, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. The divorce was finalized a few months later. The custody arrangement was amicable, and we managed to keep things civil for the kids' sake. Jessica moved into a smaller house nearby, and I stayed in the apartment for another year before buying a new place of my own. Looking back now, I can see that the affair was just a symptom of deeper issues in our marriage. Issues we never addressed, and maybe never could have. But I've stopped blaming myself for her choices. The experience changed me, but not in the way I expected. It made me stronger, more self-aware, and more determined to live an authentic life. I've learned to value honesty and loyalty above all else, not just in others, but in myself. I'm not sure what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with starting over.